Everyone says if you don't learn from history, you are doomed to repeat it. And that is happening here in America right now. In fact, America has dealt with this cycle so many times that I am surprised we have not seen a collapse of our government and democracy a lot sooner than now. But I can look at all of these events from today and line them up perfectly with things that have happened in this country just 25 years ago. Because at the end of the Clinton administration, 1999, 2000, 2001, Republicans were successful in weaponizing the culture war and the bad PR around what that man was doing in the White House with his interns. And despite the fact that a Democratic president had not only balanced our budget, but pushed us into a surplus, something we had not seen in this country in a very, very long time, we were dealing with some of the one of the best economies that the world had ever seen. The Democratic Party was facing a major PR issue. And because of that, it didn't really matter what Al Gore was running on. He was being lambasted for representing a party that had been disgraced. It didn't matter how much he advocated for, clean energy. It did not matter how much he advocated for continuing the economic policies that were helping American citizens. Republicans took the culture war and grabbed power in the White House. And guess what happened at that time? Deregulation of all these companies, all right? Oil and gas, turning up their business and polluting the planet, not unlike these AI data centers right now. Transferring wealth from lower class and middle class Americans all the way up to the richest and most wealthy Americans, and sending us headfirst into a war we had no business being in because we wanted resources from the country that we were invading. Oh, and racial tensions were at an all-time high back then because Republicans routinely turn up the rhetoric when it comes to the division in this country and use that to justify their overreach. They use that to justify their authoritarian tactics. So when I hear people say that we need to learn from 2024, I agree, but I also think we got to go further back. We need to learn from the mistakes at all of these key points in history. Because I think we should even go as far back as 1980, because Republicans did the same thing to put Reagan in office. And why is it that they get away with the same playbook over and over again? It's because we don't learn from our mistakes.
This man, Ronald Reagan, directly ruined your life. Once upon a time, a bunch of rich people sat in a room. One of them said, "Damn, I hate paying taxes." Another one said, "Bro, me too." They said, you know what we need to do, right? We need to hire somebody to convince poor people to pay more taxes while we pay less taxes. They said, that'll never work. Someone said, wait a second, I might know a guy. Because you see, at this time, Ronald Reagan was a General Electric spokesperson. He was really good at convincing poor people to do whatever the rich company General Electric wanted. But before that, he was a Democrat, an activist, very anti-racism, all for workers' rights. They said, hey, bro, we need to hire you for the opposite side. He said, you think I'm a... They said, here's a bag. He said, when do I start? You see, he took this job because his acting career was failing. So he said, hey, I'm pretty good at this. So he ran for governor of California. He won. Remember, his only jobs at this point were acting and convincing poor people to do what rich people want. And rich people loved him. He was the perfect storm. They called him the great communicator. One of his exact words were, send those welfare bums back to work. They said, Reagan! He said, but you like how I said that? No, they said, he could do no wrong. So it's only natural he becomes president of the United States. He says, okay, as my first act, I'm going to take the rich people's taxes from 70%. Yeah, fun fact, people like Elon Musk paid 70% in taxes. He said, I'm going to take it from 70% to about 28%. Everybody said, whoa, that sounds kind of low. He said, no, listen, y'all not hearing me though. He said, here's the plan. They're going to be super rich, and then they're going to want to spend more money on their companies, so then they're going to hire people like you. But people back then weren't dumb. They were like, what? He's like, but we're going to also stop those welfare black people from taking your money too, even though white people took most of the welfare money. They're like, well, I don't like black people that much. Okay, you're keep going. So he steps up the charm. He goes, y'all know me. Just see what happens when I deregulate businesses and let them do what they want. It's going to benefit you in the long run. Well, he lied, but listen closely. They were in a recession at the time. But what economists know is that after a recession, usually is a time of mini prosperity, then back to recession. It cycles. So he knew that the economy was going to go back up because that's the natural cycle. So when the economy starts going back up, he's like, see, I told you. They were like, well, he was right. But in the long run, this happens. Basically, as the economy goes up, everybody starts getting paid more. But from when he became president, everybody started getting paid the same while the economy went way up. What does that mean? Well, the money had to go somewhere, right? And it all went to the rich people. Yeah, right up until 1980, laws were protecting you a lot more than you think. After hundreds of years of Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt battling, making sure workers have rights, he in one swoop demolishes it and flips it 180. And he was the only person skilled enough to convince poor people that they need to pay more money while rich people pay less. They need to not have workers' rights, and rich people can control their rights. And to this day, Reagan's policies still stick. In fact, Donald Trump just copied Ronald Reagan. Yeah, make America great again. That was Ronald Reagan's campaign slogan. He just took it.
What's wrong with Reagan? Well, fucking everything. He was genuinely awful. I've been meaning to talk about how much Reagan sucks, but he sucks so bad I can't fit it all in one video. So this will be an inconsistent mini-series on why everybody hates Reagan. Let's get this one kicked off with a big one that never seems to get talked about. You know when you pull up to a stoplight and you just try to do everything you can do to avoid eye contact with that person standing on the corner holding a cardboard sign? Well, that awkward moment has been brought to you by Ronald Reagan. Yep, homelessness in the US is almost exclusively Ronald Reagan's fault. And this especially includes all those homeless veterans that conservatives pretend to care about every time they're trying to justify their hatred for helping, you know, immigrants or foreign allies, but then always vote to cut legislation that currently helps them and vote against any legislation that would actually help them. Then every time you hear about a mass killing or attempted mass killing or a terror attack, that's also Reagan's fault for the same reason that homelessness is Reagan's fault, and also for other reasons that are still Reagan's fault, but we'll have to get into in a different video. Now, I'm sure we've all heard that people who are part of the party of personal responsibility, blaming shit that's their fault on other people, point to places like California to show why homelessness is not their fault. Sure, homelessness is pretty bad in California, and part of that is just basic geography and population density. California has moderate weather that makes it easier for people to survive without a home, and not freeze to death. California also has the most people, and when you have the most people, you have more people that are going to be homeless, and you're also going to have more resources that homeless people can utilize to not die. To really get down to the root problem of why California has such a bad homelessness problem, we need to go back in time to 1967. Now, does anybody remember what job Ronald Reagan had in between being a shitty D-list actor and one of the worst presidents in American history? Anybody? Bueller? That's right, governor of California. As governor of California, most of the shitty things people associate with California are his fault, and this is no exception. In 1967, he signed the Lanterman-Petrish Short Act. This law made it more difficult for California to hospitalize, institutionalize, and medicate mentally ill people. As a result, patients got kicked out of the mental hospitals quite literally, and it made it exponentially more difficult for them to get back in. Group houses and boarding houses picked up some of the slack, but they were not focused on treatment or long-term care. Mentally ill people being forced into the justice system increased 50% within a year. And as a result, Reagan ended up hand-building a revolving door where people went from the streets to the justice system to group houses or boarding houses back out onto the street. On a national level, through the 1970s, the federal mental health system had been struggling as well. This was in part due to just legislative neglect over the years, and an influx of soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War who were needing new and complex treatments as a result of the trauma during their service. To address these issues, the president we needed but didn't deserve, Jimmy Carter, signed the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980, designed to fix a lot of the issues in our mental health system and get people the help that they needed. We thanked him for his efforts by replacing him with the devil incarnate that same year. Now, having a model of the absolute train wreck his legislation could do on a state level, he said, you know what, we should do that on a federal level but worse. And before the ink had even dried on Carter's Mental Health Systems Act, Reagan repealed it in the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981. Then he's like, you know, kicking all the mentally ill people out onto the street is great and all, but what about all this pesky public housing funding? Some of these gross mentally ill people could maybe use that to not live in a van down by the river, and we can't have that, so why don't we go ahead and cut another $17.5 billion from that program as well? Like, the shit was needlessly cartoonishly evil. It's so cartoonishly evil, you can't even argue that this is about fiscal responsibility, because it's over 20% cheaper for the American taxpayer to house and give homeless people mental health care than it is to leave them homeless. And that's just a direct cost to taxpayers, with homeless people getting caught up in the judicial system and the cost for law enforcement to have to deal with these problems. That doesn't factor in the economic problems that homelessness causes, like how areas with high homelessness affect businesses and property values and tourism, and the fact that a lot of these people could be productive, contributing members of society if we just gave them the right help. And yeah, Reagan was a dementia-riddled moron, but it's not like they didn't know that this was the case. Because thanks to him fucking everything up in California, we already had the blueprints to how shitty, expensive, and ineffective this system was. So when I say this was cartoonishly evil, literally the only motivation for this dog shit legislation was to punish mentally ill poor people and veterans, and do it at a higher expense to your fucking tax dollars. Now that we've covered why homelessness is pretty much exclusively Ronald Reagan's fault, and every time you see a homeless person, it should remind you to hate Ronald Reagan a little bit more. Well, that's homelessness, but what about mass killings? A person who will probably need crayons for me to explain further if they haven't connected the dots already might ask. The answer is that mentally unstable people do mentally unstable things when they don't get the help they need. Like in 1984, a California man named James Huberty called and tried to get himself committed to a mental institution and was turned away the day before he walked into a McDonald's and killed 22 people and injured 19 more, making it the worst mass shooting to date at the time. Or in 1986, when a man named John Hinckley Jr. in a deranged attempt to impress Jodie Foster almost saved America. If only he had taken some shooting lessons or picked a bigger caliber. The overall effect of this involves some conjecture, because mass killings are so statistically rare that they're really impossible to quantify with any solid correlation or causation. In fact, you are more likely to die by being executed by the state than you are to die in a mass shooting. But it is undeniable fact that some of these violent events would have been avoided had Reagan not gutted mental health institutions, along with some other policies that we'll get into in some other videos. Not to mention suicide rates, drug-related crime and overdoses, domestic abuse, and police interactions that turn violent all happen more frequently with a underfunded mental health care system. However, a lot of those things were also made worse by other Reagan policies, which we'll get into in future videos. But the fact that you feel uncomfortable every time you walk through an area with a high homeless population, and the fact that you're getting charged extra to feel that way, and the fact that that's all Reagan's fault, should be reason enough to hate him. But if it's not, don't worry, there's plenty more reasons why everybody hates Reagan.
Democrats have rolled over far too many times, right, on seating the Supreme Court justice that was denied Obama. But I honestly would go back to the 2000 election and Al Gore bowing out when he won that election. That led to John Roberts. I believe this has always been about controlling the Supreme Court, and that the real powers in this country will never allow the Supreme Court to swing to the left the way it swung to the right, because of what it would do for tax policy, for corporatism. And so we have a stolen Supreme Court, and it didn't begin with Obama. It began with Al Gore. And I believe John Roberts was put on the Supreme Court for Citizens United. And then, the rest is kind of history. But, they've been talking about the imperial presidency for a long time. They haven't been hiding this. None of this should be really surprising. I also think, when they say they want to run the country like a business, I think everybody immediately jumps to like, well, the business isn't the country doesn't make money like the way a business does. But I think what they meant was the CEO model. As Noam Chomsky said, the kind of corporate structure is the most authoritarian structure ever created. And so when they're saying they want to run it like a business, what they're saying is we want a dictator. We want an all-powerful leader that can make decisions in real time, and what he says is the law, right? Which is what a CEO is basically. A CEO answers to the board of directors on some levels, but it's about like what's actually been going on in this country for a long time. I mean, for 100 years, you could go back to Reagan, you could go back to the response to the New Deal. It's always been this tension between capitalism, which is an inherently unequal and authoritarian like economic structure, where capital is the kind of dictator, basically. Cash rules everything around us, profits over people. We have all of these sayings to illustrate those principles, but I don't think we've totally like digested them and accepted them as what we're actually dealing with here. And so, I mean, Joe Biden needs to look at this ruling and start operating within the same rules and as the Republicans. This is the big problem. I mean, I also think this is about narcissism. Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist. Whenever these people get into social structures, they lay waste to them because the structures continue to act normally and abide by standards and norms that the narcissist doesn't actually adhere to. And so it's like when they say official acts. Donald Trump never acts in service of anybody but himself. Even his official acts are acts of personal gain. And so it's all flipping all of language on its head. It's all relying on dishonest partisan judges who read reality differently based on what the political stripes are of the person acting. Again, if January 6th had somehow been done by a Democrat, it would have been like totally treated differently. It already would have been prosecuted. That former president would have been in jail already. And this is all just more of the American way, which is an unequal application of the law, where the law is designed by rich white guys to protect rich white guys just as much as it's designed to put minorities and marginalized peoples in jail. And we're just seeing it work as possible. I mean, we're heading towards fascism because of the Constitution, because we're adhering to the Constitution. The Republicans only like the Constitution when it serves them, and Democrats like can't see that like they're fighting an asymmetrical battle because they're clinging to standards, to norms, to institutions that the Republicans use at their will and exercise power in ways that Democrats never would. Democrats would never be able to steal an election, regardless of how many times Donald Trump says it. Democrats would never be able to deny Republicans a Supreme Court seat, even if they had the numbers. It just wouldn't be allowed by the culture. The media structures, which are all rooted in corporatism and right-wing owners, if you really come down to it, would sell it to the public very differently. It's manufacturing consent. I mean, you look at it now. I mean, look at the way like all of this talk online of slavery, and you can tell where we're going by how they're conditioning the Republican base, by what the Republican base is being brainwashed to say online, and it's scary as fuck right now. Yeah, I think the beginning of the end. I mean, I honestly think there's two problems that we have: a cultural problem and a political problem. And the cultural problem is reflected in our politics. People ask what the solution is. The solution would be having either a different political system that doesn't include all of these anti-democratic like institutions like the Senate and the Electoral College, or having a different population operating them. That we have been manufactured by our culture to be perfect little constituents for this abusive political system and perfect little consumers for the capitalist system, consumers and workers kind of looking at their shiny objects to buy and giving all of our time away so we can, buy shit we don't need. To me, it's like the cultural problem goes back to the backlash to the New Deal. I think Kevin Cruz's One Nation Under God does a nice job of explaining this. And the way that they not only fused kind of religion with politics, but demonized socialism and communism and anything that might kind of suggest taking the power away from the captains of industry and the kind of financial ruling class. And so, you can also go back to kind of Reconstruction, where, culturally we didn't do the things to the South, to the traitors in the South that say we did to the Germans after what happened in Germany in World War II, which is culturally root out the ideology that led to the Civil War. The South will rise again is this, I mean, it's rising again. I mean, to me, this is just the Confederacy reborn, what we're facing. That there's really not much difference. And so I think the Al Gore election, to me, I believe we live in a controlled reality, and that back then the television was still controlling reality, shaping narratives, shaping political candidates, and kind of controlling elections simply by controlling information. And they can't really allow for 3 Democratic presidents in a row, because of what it would have done to the Supreme Court, for instance. I believe it's all about managing the Supreme Court in a certain way. And that they allowed Reagan, Bush to enshrine the Reagan Revolution to protect, all of the dirt that was done under Reagan. I mean, it's no coincidence George H.W. Bush was also the director of the CIA, the only president who's also been a CIA director. That should kind of, make people look a little differently at George Bush's function, and the way Ross Perot was trotted out as the most successful candidate, third party candidate, and that weighted the deck and got Bill Clinton elected, and neoliberalism was now in play for the Democrats too. And I think, just try to imagine if if Al Gore were president during 9/11, if Al Gore had sat those Supreme Court justices. I always kind of thought with 9/11, we wouldn't have invaded Iraq, for instance, right? I mean, Afghanistan probably, but this is just, it's a cultural problem, and it manifests in our political problems, but it's really about us and the way we've been kind of engineered by our culture. The Chomsky book, Manufacturing Consent, it's manufacturing consent for all of this stuff. The way people kind of defend rich people. I had somebody ask me what I meant by rich, and talking about, well, what if you bought a $500,000 house? What is that enough for the left to want to take their money? Like, don't make me laugh. We're talking about billionaires. To me, the worst people are the ones that think having a $500,000 house makes them the ones that, like, we're talking about when we're talking about the ruling class and the financial elites. Like, literally, don't make me laugh. We're talking about people with globally destabilizing levels of wealth that are larger than the GDPs of most small to medium-sized countries. Right? It's a big difference than buying a fucking $500,000 house. But this is part of the brainwashing, is everybody thinks they're in the club. They're not fucking in the club. The club is very small, and as George Carlin said, you ain't in it, And so, to me, it's just the chickens coming home to roost of all of the cultural work we haven't done, of all of the ways we've confused culture and politics, where Democrats, like the election of Barack Obama was a cultural victory, but it didn't come with any sorts of political victories. Instead, it came with political losses. You'll never convince me that it's a coincidence that the first president denied a Supreme Court seat was also the first black president. And so I also think having a black president destabilized the country to the point of meltdown. That we weren't ready for it. I know that's unfair and kind of ugly, but that to me they went from invading countries for profit and selling it to their constituents as spreading democracy. With George Bush, the black president happens, and now they want a white dictator, and democracy is a dirty word to them. These are not coincidences. These are elements of the racism that we've never worked out of our cultural conditioning. That we're still subject. We just haven't done the cultural work that we think we have.